The first thing the workmen saw, when the November fog peeled back from the newly dug cellar of the old wool warehouse at Garrowby Hill, was a child's ribcage arranged in the shape of a lyre, the slender bones wired together so tightly that the iron had cut canals into the lime-whitened calcium. The arc of ribs was strung with catgut that still carried a soft, trembling note when the air moved, a note too low for any human throat yet perfectly pitched to the dull heartbeat that had begun to throb in the mason's own ears the instant they struck the rotten brickwork. One of the men, John Hesketh, a Methodist who had never before missed a Sunday, dropped to his knees and pressed his frost-numbed fingers to the strings, and the sound that answered was neither wind nor music but something between a lullaby and a confession, a cadence he would later tell the coroner knew my mother's maiden name and the day my little sister died. They had been hired merely to deepen the foundation so that the new owner, Mr. Silas Garth of the Providence Trading Company, might expand his storage for American cotton arriving through Hull despite the embargo and the war. Instead they uncovered a chamber no wider than a horse stall, its walls faced with the inverted skulls of 26 infants, each cranium split, scraped, and reassembled so the sutures resembled the staves of a psalter, the bone blackened by what looked like lamp oil and ground antimony. Between the skulls ran narrow gutters filled with a viscous grey ash that smelled of tallow and burnt hair. The ash had congealed into ridges that caught the lantern light like the pages of an open book. No one, not even the oldest labourer who had watched Napoleon's prisoners die in the hulks at Portsmouth, could bring himself to step fully inside. They sent for the magistrate, but the magistrate sent for the army, and the army sent for the parson, and the parson, Reverend Tobias Mallory of St. Swithin's, sent for the one man in the East Riding who was known to have looked at the face of calculated evil and not immediately fainted, Dr. Ebenezer Seton, surgeon, anatomist, keeper of the York Lunatic Asylum, and, though few dared voice it, the last confidant of those who still trafficked in the older, darker sciences that had slipped into England under the cloak of enlightenment. By the time Seton arrived on a lathered mare the following dusk, a rain as fine as ground glass had begun to fall, stippling the churned clay so that the excavation looked like a fresh wound in the flank of the wold. Torches hissed, the strings of the bone lyre, though no one had touched them again, vibrated visibly, shedding a pale dust that drifted upward against the rain. Seton stood at the lip of the pit long enough for the crowd to feel the night press inward. Then he descended the ladder alone, coat skirts tucked up, boots squelching in the ash. He traced the catgut with the tip of a scalpel, sniffed the grey residue, prized a flake of blackened bone and held it to the torch until it glowed orange, releasing a waft of sweet corruption that made even the sergeant gag. When he climbed out, his eyes carried the hollow glint of a man who has recognized a handwriting he hoped never to see again. He said only, "This is not the first. It is merely the first we were meant to find." Then he ordered the chamber re-bricked, the warehouse burnt to its joists, and the skulls conveyed under seal of secrecy to the asylum mortuary, where he himself would weigh them against the soul of the county. But that night, while the flames were still climbing the tarred beams, the lyre's note travelled 8 miles on the wind and slipped in through the cracked casement of a sleeping child at the village of Friday Thorpe. The boy, Jonas Metcalfe, 8 years old, woke with blood already crusting his left ear, and for the rest of his abbreviated life he would insist that the sound had left a word inside him, Selah, not spoken but sown, a knot of vowels that tightened whenever the moon waned. The year was 1812, the place, the high chalk wolds of Yorkshire, where the wind carries the taste of the German Ocean and every lane is flanked by graves older than the hedgerows. Silas Garth, a Connecticut man who had made a fortune smuggling contraband cotton past both British and American blockades, had purchased the derelict Garthwaite Mill and its attendant hill with the intention of turning wool into hard gold before Napoleon's wars should end and prices collapse. He brought with him a young wife, Lydia, pale, heavy-lidded, said to have been raised in the Shaker villages of Maine, and an infant daughter whose birth had nearly killed them both and whose eyes, people whispered, were already full of the disappointed wisdom of the aged. Garth himself was broad, ruddy, affable in the transatlantic fashion that Yorkshiremen distrust on instinct. He wore coats of sealskin and spoke of canals, turnpikes, and the inevitable triumph of steam. Yet within a month of arrival he had dismissed every local spinner, brought in Irish loom operatives who spoke no English, and ordered the construction of a high brick wall so that no passer-by might see what occurred within the yard. The wall was topped with fragments of bottle glass set in lime, but the glass was green, not the usual brown, and on certain evenings, when the sun lay sideways across the wold, the broken bottles cast a light the color of bruised skin across the road so that horses shied and women crossed themselves. Lydia was rarely seen, when she did emerge, veiled, to walk the terraces of the hillside garden. Gardeners noticed that she moved as though the ground itself might open, planting her parasol like an anchor each time the wind gusted. The child, called Mercy, though she showed none, was kept indoors entirely. The only evidence of her existence was a lullaby that drifted from an upper window at dusk, a melody in a minor key that the Irish workers soon took up, humming it while they fed the carding engines, though none could have told you the words. Old men recalled that the hill had always been unlucky, a Roman signal tower whose garrison vanished without spear or standard, a medieval leper field whose stones still surfaced at plough time like teeth, a Civil War massacre too shameful for any parish register. They said also that the wind on Garrowby carried fragments of languages no living tongue had spoken, and that if you stood upon the ridge at midwinter you might hear your own voice answer you from a mile away, speaking sentences you had not yet thought. Such talk was dismissed by Methodists and magistrates alike as the superstition of a countryside still afraid of its own shadows, yet even the dismissals carried a nervous haste, as though to linger too long on the topic were to invite demonstration. Thus the discovery of the bone chamber was less a revelation than a confirmation, and the speed with which the authorities sought to bury it again was matched only by the speed with which rumour tunnelled beneath every door from Beverley to Bridlington. Within a week the story had grown fangs. The skulls were not infants but fetuses taken from the lying-in ward at York Dispensary. The lyre was strung with sutures cut from the living. The ash was the residue of hair shorn from Plague Dead at Hull in '99. Children began to play a skipping game whose rhyme ended, Silas Garth, he counts the bones, 1 for the mill and 2 for the stones, and mothers dragged them indoors when the dusk sky turned the color of damp flannel. Yet the warehouse burned, the site was leveled, and by Christmas the hill lay under snow so deep that even the memory of fire seemed extinguished. Only Dr. Seaton, in his frostbitten study above the asylum gatehouse, kept the skulls ranged along a deal shelf, each labelled in his microscopic hand, unknown, 36 gestational weeks, Fontenelle inscribed with Hebrew numeral 12. He had traced the numerals with a camel hair brush and ink made of soot and his own blood, and every night at 11 o'clock he turned the skulls to face the wall, fearing that otherwise they might watch him as he slept. But one skull, number 7, he never turned. It remained forever outward-looking, its calcified orbits trained upon the door, and on nights when the moon was dark he fancied he could hear from its hollow a faint thrumming, as of a string stretched to the point of grief. Seaton had first encountered such workmanship 15 years earlier, in the winter of '97, when a packet had arrived at the York Anatomy Theatre addressed to the curator of unfinished music. Inside, packed in salt and sawdust, lay a human radius fashioned into a tuning peg, its marrow-hole threaded with silver wire that trembled whenever the bell of St. Maurice told the hour. No letter accompanied it, only a scrap of vellum on which had been copied, in a hand identical to that later found on the infant skulls, the opening bars of the Miserere transposed into a key that human vocal cords cannot compass. Seaton, then a restless young man with more curiosity than caution, had fitted the peg into an old viola and tightened the wire until the instrument's belly split. From the split had issued a sigh that smelled of chrism and damp stone, and for 3 nights thereafter he dreamed of a cathedral whose pillars were living children, their mouths open in perpetual song. He had buried the viola in the asylum grounds, yet the dreams persisted, growing more architectural, until he learned to dose himself with laudanum strong enough to silence even the stone. The arrival of the bone liar, then, was not an isolated atrocity but the latest sentence in a correspondence he had been too cowardly to answer, and the knowledge sat in his gut like ice that refuses to melt. He understood now that the skulls were not relics but annotations, a marginalia carved into the bone text of the world by a scholar whose library was the grave. What he did not yet know, what he would come to know only when the winter had tightened its grip until the frozen ground rang like iron, was that the author of these psalms had once walked the corridors of the asylum itself, a resident disguised as a keeper, a singer masked as a mute. The name by which this person had been entered in the ledger was Jeff the Heart, sex doubtful, age estimated at 30, found wandering the roads near Patrington with no tongue and no fingerprints, carrying in a canvas sack the calcinated femur of a child and a scrap of paper on which had been written, "I have prepared the octave." Seaton had been junior surgeon the night Hart was admitted. He remembered the creature's eyes, the color of water that has reflected too much sky, and the way the mute had smiled when the warden spoke of shackles, a smile that had seemed to listen rather than to express. Within a month Hart had vanished, leaving only the sack and a hole in the cell wall cut with such precision that the stone edges resembled the perforations on a sheet of music. The memory had been filed away beneath the sediment of 1,000 later lunacies, but the night after the burning of the warehouse Seaton woke to find the scrap of paper, "I have prepared the octave," pinned to his counterpane with a splinter of human clavicle. He rose, lit a candle, and walked the corridors barefoot, checking each locked door, yet every inmate slept the sleep of the sedated, and the only sound was the wind worrying the gutters like a dog with a marrow bone. Still, when he returned to his room, the skull on the shelf, number 7, had rotated itself 90 degrees so that its orbital hollows regarded him with what he could only call anticipation. He spoke to it then, the first time he had addressed bone aloud since childhood prayers, asking what verse came next, and the skull answered not in words but by cracking along the sagittal suture, a hairline fracture that bled a single drop of mercury which rolled across the deal board and vanished into a knothole. From the knothole arose an odor of wet parchment and lilies, and Seaton knew that the octave had indeed been prepared, that the next note would be struck not by him but by the hill itself, and that the interval between would be measured in lives. Snow fell for 9 consecutive days, during which no cart, no rider, no postboy could force the road between York and the coast. The isolation was not remarked upon. Winters here were often severed from the world, and parishes survived on hoarded oatmeal and stories. Yet when the thaw arrived, and the first carrier's sled crested Garrowby, the driver found the track lined on both sides with objects planted like mileposts. Children's spinning tops carved from the knuckle bones of horses, each top inked with a red Hebrew letter that ran in sequence from Aleph to Tav. The tops were fixed to willow twigs so that the wind spun them, and as they spun they emitted a chatter like teeth in a cold room, a sound that made the sled dog foam and the driver lash his reins until the leather cut his gloves. He arrived at the Garth estate white-lipped, convinced that the hill had been reading itself aloud in a tongue of whirling consonants. What he did not see, because the thaw had softened the earth and the spinners had sunk several inches, was that beneath each top lay a mirrored shard of green bottle glass arranged so that the sun, when it broke through, flashed a single letter upward into the eyes of anyone ascending. Thus the hill itself had become a psalm, its verses spelled backwards in the optic nerve, and every traveller carried away an after-image that lingered for days like the glare of a solar eclipse. Silas Garth, when he heard, ordered the objects removed, but his Irish labourers refused to touch them, and when he beat one with a hazel stick the man's eyes rolled up so that only the white showed, and from his mouth poured the lullaby that had haunted the nursery window, now rendered in a guttural bass that seemed to originate below the diaphragm. Garth himself, for the first time since his arrival, felt the floor of certainty tilt. He heard in the lullaby the cadence of the Connecticut River, where he had once seen a Shaker elder walk across the ice carrying a newborn child that steamed in the frost like fresh bread. That night he locked every door of the house, yet the lullaby entered anyway, riding the drafts, pooling in the parlor like water seeking its own level. Lydia, his wife, sat at the pianoforte and attempted to drown it with a Scarlatti minuet, but her fingers stumbled into a chromatic descent that matched the singer note for note, and the instrument's spruce soundboard split with a sigh that smelled of cedar and afterbirth. Mercy, the child, began to scream, a sound so thin and continuous that it seemed less a cry than a filament drawn from her mouth to the roof of the world. Garth fled to the mill, where the carding engines loomed like condemned giants, and there, among the bales of American cotton, he found every spindle wrapped with a single strand of black hair that had not been there at dusk. He seized a lamp, meaning to burn the entire stock, but the flame guttered blue and the glass chimney cracked, releasing a gust of air that tasted of salt and wet linen, and in that gust he heard his own voice say, "The measure is not yet full." He understood then that the cotton itself, every fiber of it, had been grown in soil once dressed with the blood of captive Africans, that the bales were already a scripture, that the Bone-Psalmist had merely added marginalia in a script of calcium and catgut. Ownership, he realized, was a fiction the dead permitted the living to entertain until the reckoning of fibers and bones should balance. He staggered home through lanes where the snow had refrozen into ridges sharp enough to slice a boot sole, and at every step the green glass in the hedges flashed its single letter into his eyes, so that by the time he reached the portico he was weeping blood that froze in crimson beads upon his cheeks. Inside, Lydia awaited him, cradling Mercy, whose screams had ceased. The child's mouth was open, but the sound had been replaced by a low humming that vibrated the curtains and set the chandelier crystals swaying like pendulums, counting down to an hour that had never before been needed. She looked at him across the width of the Persian rug and said, "Husband, the next verse requires your signature," and in her arms the infant's pupils dilated into twin voids through which he could see the warehouse burning again. But this time the flames were cold and the ashes rose upward, reassembling themselves into the shape of a lyre larger than the sky. The lyre in the sky was not a vision but a scaffold, its strings composed of the night's own darkness drawn tight enough to slice the constellations, and where the beams crossed, knots of starlight bled a silver dust that drifted downward onto the roof slates and hissed like gentle rain. Silas Garth stood in the doorway of his own parlor, feeling the lintel press against his shoulder blades as though the house itself attempted to expel him, and he noticed that the wallpaper, imported French damask patterned with acanthus, had begun to unfurl at the seams, revealing beneath it not bare plaster but an older paper printed with the same red Hebrew letters that had marked the spinning tops along the road. The letters ran vertically, a column of consonants without vowels, and as he watched they appeared to crawl, rearranging themselves into a text his eyes understood faster than his mind, a ledger of weights, not of goods but of sinew, of breath, of the minutes remaining between cradle and grave. Lydia still held the child, rocking gently, her face obscured by the veil she had worn even indoors since the day of her arrival. The veil was stitched from layers of silk so fine that lamplight passed through it like dusk through fog, and beneath its shimmer her features seemed to dissolve and reform with each pulse of the chandelier. Mercy's humming had modulated into a cadence recognizable as the opening of the Dies Irae, but slowed until each note lasted the length of a human heartbeat, a tempo that forced Garth's own pulse to synchronize, so that he felt his blood hesitate, surge, hesitate, as though the heart itself debated whether to continue. He tried to speak, to demand what curse she had brought with her from the Shaker villages where, it was said, the gift of song was bartered for the gift of silence, but his tongue adhered to the roof of his mouth, and when he prized it free he tasted iron and recognized the flavor of his own blood printed on the air as if the house had taken an impression of every oath he had ever sworn. Lydia turned then, and the veil lifted for an instant, not by wind, for the windows were closed, but by the same agency that lifts the lid from a pot when the broth within begins to boil, and he saw her face fully for the first time since their wedding night, the skin translucent as onion parchment, the cheekbones carved inward until they formed a pair of inward-facing blades, and between them a mouth sewn shut with catgut the color of old piano wire. The stitches were not crude, they followed the curve of her lips in a perfect arc, each knot tied with the precision of a surgeon or a lace maker, and the flesh had grown over the thread so that the seam appeared almost decorative, a red filigree suggesting a smile that had been decided against. Her eyes, however, were open, and they regarded him with a patience so absolute that he felt the years of their marriage collapse into a single moment of appraisal, as though she had been waiting not for his words but for the instant when words themselves should become unnecessary. From beneath the hem of her gown emerged a sound of dripping, slow and deliberate. He looked down and saw that a dark pool spread outward across the Turkey carpet, not blood but a liquid that smelled of rain-soaked hymnals, and where it touched the pile the colors reversed so that the crimson roses became pale funereal lilies and the indigo border bled into the white of unwritten margins. The child Mercy lifted one hand, and in the hollow between her small palm and the swollen knuckles of her mother's grip a single drop of mercury formed, perfectly spherical, reflecting in miniature the lyre still hanging above the house, and when the drop fell it struck the pool without displacement, sinking as though the carpet were merely the surface of a deeper reservoir. Garth felt his knees buckle, but before he could fall the floorboards beneath him flexed, assuming the curve of a ship's deck in heavy seas, and he understood that the entire manor had become the resonating box of an instrument whose strings were drawn from the sinews of those who had once lived here and had never been permitted to leave. The chandelier above began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster, until the candles described rings of fire that scorched the ceiling plaster, revealing again the same red letters now carved not into wallpaper but into the beams themselves, and as the wheel of light accelerated he saw that each candle was shortening at a rate that defied the conservation of wax, as though time for the flames were being compressed, consumed, so that the hour might be reached when the final note should sound. He reached out a hand toward Lydia, not for comfort but for confirmation that she too felt the vortex, yet she stepped backward into the curtain shadow, and where her feet passed the carpet fibers rose like the nap on velvet brushed the wrong way, refusing to accept her weight, so that she appeared to glide, a processional figure in a liturgy that required no congregation beyond the dead already present. The child's humming ceased, the chandelier stopped, the candles guttered simultaneously, and in the sudden dark he heard the front door, 3 rooms distant, swing open on hinges that had been greased only that morning yet now screamed as though rusted by centuries of salt wind. Footsteps entered, deliberate, unhurried, the gait of someone who has crossed the snow barefoot and finds the temperature agreeable. Each footfall struck the flagstones with the resonance of a mallet on a xylophone bar, and Garth recognized the sequence, the opening notes of the Miserere, ascending, the same progression that had split the viola years ago in Seaton's lecture theatre. Between the notes a voice, not heard but remembered, recited the psalmist's bargain, "Thou desirest not sacrifice, else would I give it, thou delightest not in burnt offering, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit." The footsteps paused outside the parlor door, and the mercury drop rose again from the carpet, reversing its fall, climbing the air as though gravity itself had been inverted for the sake of a single syllable still lacking. Garth found that he could move, but only backward. Each step erased a memory, the taste of his mother's cider, the smell of new-mown timothy, the curve of Lydia's waist beneath starched linen, until he arrived at the window, where the frost had etched on the inside of the glass the final letter tav, the sign of the covenant sealed. Behind him the door opened without human touch, and the draught that entered carried the odor of the excavation, wet lime, charred hair, and beneath these the sweeter scent of lullabies repeated until the words lost meaning and became pure interval, the gap between what was promised and what was taken. He turned, pressing his spine against the glass, and saw in the aperture not a figure but an absence shaped like a man, a silhouette cut from the fabric of the house so that the corridor beyond showed through in negative, and where the face should be a single string vibrated, catgut stretched between the floor and the ceiling rose, emitting the note that had hovered just beyond the range of mortal hearing, the note that now descended into the cavity of his chest and wrapped itself around his heart like a tuning key. The heartbeat that had faltered now steadied, but at a new pitch, and he felt the organ revolve within its cage of ribs, aligning itself to the tension of the string, and he knew that the next time the lyre in the sky was plucked his pulse would answer, and the interval between the two would be the measure of his remaining days. Lydia stepped forward, offered the child toward the silhouette as one might offer a dish of bitter herbs, and the absence received her, the small body passing through the darkness without resistance, yet as mercy crossed the threshold the veil of Lydia's face tore downward, the threads popping like miniature gunshots, and beneath the silk her mouth was revealed, not sewn but open, wider than human bone should permit, a void extending backward into the skull's interior where the same single string vibrated, her body now merely the resonating chamber for a note that had begun centuries ago and would not cease until the last echo had been accounted for. Garth tried to scream, but the sound emerged as a perfect A-flat that matched the string. And the window behind him shattered outward, the frost letter dispersing into the night on a cloud of diamond dust that drifted across the snow toward the village, carrying the vibration into every cottage where sleepers turned in their beds and dreamed of infants singing from open graves. The silhouette receded, carrying the child, but the string remained, anchored in the center of the parlor floor, quivering like the tongue of a bell, and he understood that the house itself had become the next instrument, that the hill, the mill, the warehouse, the village, the entire ridge were merely frets on a fingerboard stretched across the wold, and that the psalmist's hand, whether divine, human, or neither, was already moving to strike the succeeding note. He fell to his knees, not in supplication but in preparation, for the compulsion had seized him to place his own hand upon the string, to feel its tension, to measure the interval between what had been taken and what might yet be returned, and as his fingertips approached the catgut he saw that the flesh had already begun to part, the ridges of his fingerprints unraveling like silk threads, offering themselves as the next filament in a score that required no ink because the paper was the living world and the notes were days. Outside, the thaw resumed, the snow slid from the roof in a single mass that struck the ground with the sound of a muffled drum, and somewhere beneath that sound another note rose, lower, longer, the beginning of the next verse. In the asylum at York, Dr. Seaton woke from a dream in which he had been reading a book whose pages were made of frost. Each time he turned a sheet it melted, and the words, read, Hebrew, sank into the skin of his palms, traveling upward toward the heart whose beat he no longer trusted to keep time. He rose, lit a candle, and walked to the shelf where the 26 skulls waited. Number 7 had cracked entirely now, the fracture describing a perfect circle that enclosed the sagittal suture like a halo, and from the circle oozed another drop of mercury that rolled across the wood and fell into the same knothole, but this time he heard it strike bottom, a splash so distant that he calculated the depth at nearly a mile, as though the floor of his study opened directly into the shaft of a mine that had never been charted. He dressed, wrapped the skull in a linen shroud, and descended to the courtyard, where the night smelled of turned earth and the approaching rain carried the metallic taste of ploughshares. He understood that the interval had elapsed, that the next note was due, and that he, like Garth, like Lydia, like the child, was merely a string that had been stretched long ago and was about to be plucked. Behind him, the asylum windows began to glow, not with lamplight but with the colder phosphorescence of bone struck by moonlight, and he heard the inmates stirring, a rustle of straw and shackles, a collective inhalation as though every lung prepared to sing the same syllable, the word that rhymes with Selah but is never written, only intoned at the moment the grave closes over and the echo begins its journey backward toward the womb. The road from York to Garrowby Hill was a scar across the wold, a chalk incision that healed nightly with frost and reopened at dawn under the teeth of cart wheels, and Dr. Seaton rode it with the wrapped skull cradled against his breast like a confessor who has agreed to carry the last sin of a dying man but has not yet decided whether absolution or publication serves the greater good. The sky had lowered until the moon appeared not to rise but to be revealed, a white bone gradually unsheathed from a sleeve of cloud, and its light fell upon the hedgerows with the precision of a scalpel, stripping every twig of mercy so that the blackthorn seemed already fashioned into the crown it would become when winter deepened. He had not taken the mail coach, he had not taken a servant, he had taken only the mare that had carried him to battlefields in the Low Countries and had learned there to ignore the smell of human burning, yet even this beast shied when the wind brought the scent of green bottle glass ground into frost, a smell that reminded Seaton of the hospitals where amputated limbs were disposed of in lime pits so shallow that dogs could unearth them by morning. At each mile the skull within the linen shifted, not violently but with the gentle insistence of a sleeper turning toward a sound only dreamers can hear, and he found himself speaking to it in a whisper that tasted of mercury and confession. You were not meant to be found, you were meant to be read, and I have read you wrongly, as one reads a fever chart instead of the poem beneath the numbers. The mare's hoofbeats began to answer a rhythm not their own. He realized they had fallen into the pace of the lullaby that had issued from the Irish looms, a tempo that compressed 4 beats into 3 so that the heart anticipated a syllable that never arrived, creating a vacuum that filled itself with dread. At the crest of the final ridge he halted, for the valley below was no longer dark. Every cottage window glowed with the same cold phosphorescence he had left behind in the asylum, and the illumination moved from house to house like a reader's finger tracing a line across a page, pausing at each dwelling long enough to extract a vowel which it carried onward, spelling invisibly across the snow a word that could be pronounced only by the dead. He dismounted, tied the reins to a gatepost already scarred by the wire that had held the spinning tops, and proceeded on foot, the skull now warm against his ribs as though the mercury within had begun to pulse with separate life. The first cottage belonged to the widow Markham, whose husband had hanged himself in the lintel of his own barn after the failure of the '07 harvest. Seaton had sewn his eyelids shut and had noted the expression of relief that had settled upon the dead man's mouth, as though at last he had arrived at an appointment long postponed. The door stood open, and within, the widow sat fully dressed in her Sunday bombazine, her hands folded upon a Bible whose pages had been razored out and replaced with sheets of parchment cut to the same size, each sheet inscribed with a single red letter that together formed not words but scales, a music that could be read only if one held the book to the light of a candle and allowed the shadows to fall across the parchment like bars. She looked up, recognized him, and spoke without moving her lips, the voice issuing from the center of her chest as though her sternum had been converted into a soundbox. "Doctor, the measure is nearly full, the widow's cruise runs over, but the oil is not oil, and the meal is not meal." He asked what remained to be weighed, and she opened her hands. The skin split along the creases like overripe fruit, and from the fissures fell a scatter of rice grains that upon touching the floor rolled toward the hearth, where they arranged themselves into the shape of an infant no larger than a man's thumb, the grains adhering by their own moisture so that the tiny figure appeared to breathe. The rice child turned its head toward the skull beneath Seaton's coat, opened a mouth no wider than a needle-eye, and sang a single note pitched so exactly between C and C-sharp that the ear perceived it as both and neither. A note that caused the widow's pupils to dilate until the irises vanished and the eyes became twin voids reflecting the same corridor he had walked in dreams where children stood as pillars. Seaton backed away, but the note followed, not through the air but through the marrow of his bones, vibrating the fracture in skull number 7 so that the haloed crack widened by a hair's breadth and the mercury within rose a fraction closer to the rim. Outside, the phosphorescence had advanced. It now illuminated the schoolhouse where the master had flogged a boy for misspelling psalmist and the boy had bled from the ear and never spoken again. The windows were open, and from them drifted pages of copybooks on which every pupil had written the same sentence across and down the page, Selah, 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 until the paper itself had become a sieve through which the candlelight passed, projecting the word upon the snow in letters tall as men. He hurried on, past the baker's oven where loaves had risen overnight without yeast and had cracked open to reveal the impression of teeth baked into the crumb, past the smithy where the anvil rang though no hand held the hammer, each blow sounding the interval that had haunted Garth's heart, A-flat descending by a half-tone that suggested a question to which the next note would be the irrevocable answer. At the crossroads stood the parson, Reverend Mallory, bareheaded, his prayer book replaced by a shepherd's crook carved from a human femur, the knob formed by the condyle polished to ivory by the palms of generations who had leaned upon it while reciting the burial service over graves that refused to remain shut. Mallory's eyes were fixed upon the hill where the warehouse had stood. The ruin was gone, erased by snow and fire, yet in its place rose a structure visible only when the eye moved sideways, a lattice of lines that intersected at angles impossible for timber or stone, the negative space between them vibrating like the strings of the bone lyre now enlarged to the scale of landscape. The parson spoke without turning. "Doctor, you carried the first letter, the widow has offered the last. Between them we are become the words that were spoken before the foundation of the world, and the tune is not given to be sung but to be suffered." Seaton asked what might be done to silence it, and Mallory lifted the femur crook, pointing toward the manor house where every window blazed with the same cold fire, the light arranged in the pattern of the red letters so that from the distance the building appeared to be a page held up to the moon, the text legible only if one stood at the exact spot where the road dipped and the eye aligned the chimneys with the ridge of the distant wold. To silence it, the parson said, one must finish the psalm, and the finishing requires a voice that has never broken, a string that has never been slackened, a weight measured not in pounds but in the absence of hope, and as he spoke he rested the crook upon the snow, and where it touched the whiteness melted in the shape of a footprint so small it could belong only to the child who had vanished into the silhouette at Garth's parlour door. Seaton felt the skull move again, more urgently, and he unwrapped it, cradling the cranium in his palms. The bone was hot now, and the haloed fracture had widened into a circle that enclosed the entire vault so that the skull appeared to wear a crown of its own dust, and from within the circle the mercury rose, not as a drop but as a thread, extruding itself into the air where it hung vibrating, drawing from the surrounding night a succession of overtones that matched the windows, the loaves, the anvil, the widow's rice child, every sound that had been extracted from the village and pressed into service as notation. The thread lengthened, seeking direction, and Seaton understood that it was a stylus, that the air itself had become parchment, and that the next letter would be inscribed not upon paper or bone but upon the living darkness, where it would remain visible to anyone who should ever again stand upon this ridge and doubt that the earth keeps its accounts in anything so fragile as flesh. He turned toward the manor, and as he did the mercury dipped, writing upon the night a letter that was neither Hebrew nor Greek nor any alphabet yet devised, a character that existed only as the interval between two heartbeats, the pause in which the body realizes it has been abandoned by the soul. The village behind him fell silent, even the anvil ceased, and in that hush he heard the sound of every sleeper exhaling at once, a communal sigh that carried the odor of lullabies and wet earth, and he knew that the measure was now complete, the verse finished, the next stanza waiting to be spoken by whoever should open their mouth first when the echo returned from the far side of the wold. He began to walk toward the manor, each footstep erasing the letter he had just inscribed, the snow refreezing behind him so that no trace remained, the perfect erasure that is the privilege of texts written upon the wind. Yet as he moved he felt the skull cool, the mercury retract, the fracture narrow, as though the bone itself had been granted a reprieve conditional upon his arrival at the house before the next candle should burn down to its socket. The door of Garth's manor stood open, as he had known it would, and within, the hall was lit not by candles but by the green shimmer of bottle glass set into the walls, each shard reflecting a fragment of the lyre that still hung invisible above the ridge. so that the corridor resembled the interior of a whale's belly lined with luminous barnacles, a throat through which he must pass to arrive at the place where the final note would be sounded. He stepped across the threshold, and the door closed behind him without sound, the latch settling into its keep with the gentleness of a confessor laying his hand upon the head of the penitent, and the skull in his hands grew weightless, as though the mercury had begun to ascend, drawing the bone upward, seeking the ceiling where the beams were already scored with the preliminary marks of the next stanza, the verses that would require not 26 infant heads but one adult heart split into 26 chambers, each chamber tuned to the pitch of a grief that had never been named aloud. The heart he offered was not metaphor. When Seaton reached the center of the hallway, the floorboards parted as neatly as theater curtains, revealing a pit no wider than a man's chest but of such depth that the candle shine falling into it seemed to descend for years without finding bottom. A single beam of timber remained across the aperture, plain, smooth, and smelling of resin, and upon it lay a scalpel of the kind he had once used to open the skulls of the insane in search of the seat of melancholy. The instrument was not his own, its handle was carved from the metacarpal of a child, the shaft inlaid with the same red letters now glowing like wires heated in a forge, and beside it rested a length of catgut already threaded through the eye, the gut still moist, breathing almost as though it remembered the warmth of the intestine from which it had been flayed. He understood the invitation to dissect himself while still sensible, to extract the organ and divide it into the 26 chambers required, each chamber to be tuned by the insertion of a fragment of infant bone taken from the skull he carried. The mercury within the cranium had risen to the rim and now held the shape of a lens that reflected his own face distorted into the aspect of an embryo, the eyes fused, the mouth a bud, the expression one of unbearable anticipation. He placed the skull upon the beam, and the fracture completed itself with a sound like ice breaking on a river at the first thaw. The vault fell open into 2 symmetrical halves, each lined with the silver film of mercury that quivered and resolved into the image of a musical stave upon which the notes were not cymbals but droplets of blood falling in perfect quaver values. The first note was already inscribed, the A-flat that had haunted Garth's pulse, the widow's lullaby, the anvil's question. To sound it truly required the first chamber of the heart, and he lifted the scalpel, felt its borrowed bone handle fit the hollow of his palm as though grown there, and without further ceremony drew the blade along the line of his left fifth rib, following the path he had traced on 100 cadavers but never on living flesh. The pain arrived delayed, like a messenger who had paused at the crossroads to read the proclamation he carried, and when it reached him it was not agony but recognition, the heart exposing itself to the air it had never been meant to breathe, the muscle flinching as a night bird flinches when sudden lantern light annihilates the darkness that gave it shelter. He parted the pericardium with the delicacy of a man opening a love letter he already knows will end every hope, and the heart lay revealed, not red but the color of dusk seen through closed eyelids, a bruised luminescence that pulsed once, twice, then stilled itself as though awaiting the conductor's baton. With the catgut he ligated the vessels, tied the knots in the sequence he had learned from the Hebrew numerals, 12 loops for the tribes, 12 for the months, 2 for the interval between breath and echo. The organ came free into his hands, warm, heavier than he remembered from the dead, and he laid it upon the beam where it continued to beat, each contraction squeezing a drop of blood that rolled across the wood and was absorbed by the metacarpal handle, feeding the bone that had once been a child's hand now employed in the work of unmaking a man. He divided the apex with a single stroke, and the heart opened like a book whose pages are still wet from the press. Within the ventricles he placed the first fragment, tiny, no larger than a fleck of mortar, the nasal bone of skull number 7, and as it seated itself the mercury on the stave quivered and the A-flat sounded, not through the air but through the timber of the house. A vibration that traveled downward into the foundations and upward into the invisible lyre, tightening one string by exactly the breadth of a hair. The second chamber demanded the parietal of skull number 6. He cut, inserted, heard the note rise a semitone, the interval that turns lamentation into accusation. One by one he filled the chambers, each fragment chosen by the mercury itself, which tilted within the halved vault like a compass needle seeking the pole of its own extinction. With each insertion the house changed, the green bottle glass melted and ran down the walls in rivulets that cooled into veins of jade, the ceiling beams contracted, the grain tightening until the wood sang under the strain, the staircase twisted into a spiral that descended rather than ascended, each step a vertebra extracted from some enormous creature whose skeleton had served as the blueprint for architecture itself. Blood pooled beneath the beam, but instead of spreading it rose, columnar, forming a red organ pipe that emitted the notes as they were tuned, a flute of human hymn playing the psalm whose text was the gradual abolition of mercy. When the 26th fragment, the metopic suture of skull number 1, was fitted into the final chamber, the heart ceased its autonomous beating and became instead a single clenched fist of muscle and bone, a knot tied in the rope of arteries, the tourniquet that would allow the rest of the body to die while preserving the music intact. He lifted this fist, now no larger than a walnut, and placed it into the mercury stave. The metal closed over it like a mouth-accepting host, and the entire score rose into the air, a page of liquid light that hovered before his eyes and displayed the completion of the psalm, the final sealer written not as word but as the shape of the interval between the last note and the silence that would follow it, a gap measured by the length of a child's last breath. The beam beneath him cracked, the pit widened, the house began its collapse inward, not in ruin but in transcription, every plank, every nail, every shard of glass assuming its place in the score, the manor becoming a vast unfolded manuscript whose ink was the history of every life that had touched the hill. He felt his own body diminish, the ribs folding like paper, the lungs expelling the final pocket of air which carried the odor of lullabies and wet earth, and he understood that the sacrifice was not his heart alone but the memory that he had ever possessed, the erasure of his name from the ledger of the living so that the psalm might stand authorless, a work dictated by the earth itself to a scribe who had been mistaken for a man. As the walls closed around him, the green light blended with the red of the organ pipe, producing a color for which no tongue has ever invented a name, the hue of the instant when the eye relinquishes sight and begins to see backward into the womb of time. The last thing he perceived was the silhouette of the child Mercy, now no child but the embodiment of the interval, standing upon the mercury page, her feet not sinking but poised upon the surface as upon a frozen river, her mouth open to receive the final note, her eyes two voids through which he glimpsed the ridge as it had been before the first stone was laid, before the first bone was broken, when the hill was only a swelling in the spine of the world awaiting the hand that would pluck it. The sound that followed was not loud, it was the opposite of sound, the creation of a silence so complete that every creature for miles around woke simultaneously, convinced they had gone deaf, and in that silence the psalm was finished, the lyre dissolved, the strings released from tension, the mercury sublimated into air that would carry the memory of the note into every rainfall, every frost, every cradle song hummed by mothers who would never know why their children's dreams smelled of wet parchment and lilies. Morning arrived without color. The villagers rose to find the manor gone, not razed but absent, the space it had occupied now a smooth depression in the hillside as though a gigantic hand had pressed downward and left the earth to remember the shape of what had been taken. No timber, no brick, no shard of bottle glass remained, only the single beam across the pit, and upon it the dry, contracted fist of the heart, now indistinguishable from a knot of root or a fossilized apple, hard as stone, light as breath. Silas Garth was found sitting on the ridge, his eyes wide, his mouth open to the sky, his pupils reflecting an empty stave across which a single drop of mercury crawled, writing and erasing the same letter forever. Lydia was never discovered. Some claimed she had walked into the widow's house and dissolved into the wallpaper, her veil unraveling until it became the pattern of red letters that now appeared on every wall in the village, a pattern that faded when stared at directly but returned in peripheral vision like the afterimage of the sun. The child mercy existed only as an absence felt whenever a mother counted her offspring and found herself one short. Though all were present, the space beside the cradle where no child stood became the shape of the interval, a reminder that the psalm had required a voice that had never broken. Dr. Seaton's absence was noted only by the asylum, where the inmates reported that the skulls had vanished from the shelf, leaving behind 26 cracks in the wood that, when viewed from the doorway, formed the outline of a lyre so precise that no craftsman could have carved it, the fractures bleeding a faint dust that smelled of chrism and damp stone. Years passed. The ridge grew barley, then turnips, then barley again. Children were born, aged, died. The warehouse was rebuilt, burnt again, rebuilt once more, each time leaving a cellar shallower than before, as though the ground itself refused to be excavated beyond the depth of a single heartbeat. Travelers at night sometimes heard a note, neither high nor low, that caused the horses to sweat and the dogs to whine, but the sound was always attributed to wind in the telegraph wires, though no wires ran across Garrowby until decades later, and when they did the hum that accompanied them carried the same interval, the same A-flat that had once been the measure of a man's remaining days. The fist of heart and bone remained upon the beam, untouched by weather, by crow or rat, by the curious fingers of boys who dared one another to approach it. Eventually a shed was built over it, and the shed became a shrine, and the shrine fell into disrepair, and the beam rotted until only the fist lay upon the ground, indistinguishable from any stone. Yet if one placed an ear to it at the instant the sun set exactly behind the ridge, one could hear within the percussion of distant footsteps. Descending a staircase that spiraled downward rather than up, a sound that ceased the moment the listener straightened, uncertain whether what had been heard was music or the memory of music, the echo of the psalm that had never been sung aloud but had been suffered into the fibre of the hill itself. And so the account ends, not with revelation but with transmission. The ridge remains, the road descends, the rain carries the taste of mercury and lilies into every well, and whenever a child learns to hum before it learns to speak, the mothers of Yorkshire turn their faces to the wall, listening for the interval that will tell them whether the next verse has begun.